Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 283. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, and you got another Iran update for us and a lot of important stuff going on there. So just want to remind people they can share today's show from the Libertarian Institute. Find it on the blog at antiwar.com. You can follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. Watch the video version of the show on YouTube, Rumble, or Odyssey. It's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts and on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. And you could donate to the show at Patreon, Subscribestar, or through crypto. All that information in the show notes page. In the show notes page, you can also find the information for the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. The URL is palomaverdecbd.com. The promo code is PEACE. That'll save you 20% when you spend $75 or more, and it gets the show a kickback. So it's a great way to get yourself some high-quality CBD products and to help your favorite podcast. Connor, what do you like from Paloma Verde?
I really recommend the soft gels. They're full spectrum, so whatever you're dealing with, any kind of inflammation, it'll hit that in a half hour. Love the tinctures because it's like the best bang for your buck. I would argue probably the strongest dose of CBD that is available, and it lasts a very long time. And then the gummy bears are always delicious, and those act immediately. So those are all great. And then also I definitely recommend the CBD treats for your dogs as well.
All right, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. And Connor, I'll just let you get into it. I know you got your notes all set up and everything, so what's going on with Iran?
All right, so Israel carried out a very high-profile assassination in the heart of Tehran of a senior IRGC colonel. And of course, this is with the backdrop of everything we've been covering week to week. Such a big deal because the whole I'll get into this, but certainly the IRGC issue was one of the main, if not the worst sticking point, keeping talks in this state of seemingly perpetual deadlock going nowhere good fast. So on May 22nd, which was Sunday, Israel carried out this killing of Colonel Hassan Sayed Kodeh. He was gunned down while he was parked in his driveway by two men on motorcycles, which bears some of the hallmarks of previous Israeli assassinations that have been carried out in Iran, like of nuclear scientists. Now, speculation that Israel was responsible came immediately, again, because of the resemblance, and not only that, because they have the capability to do something like this, and also they have the most obvious motive. By the following day, President Raisi was calling for revenge, saying he blamed the murder on the hand of global arrogance, using colorful language to refer to the U.S., Israel, and their allies. The spokesman for the IRGC accused Israel directly, declaring the thugs and terrorist groups affiliated with global oppression and Zionism will face consequences for their actions. Iran is yet to take official responsibility. But Reuters reported that Israel is yet to take official responsibility still. But Reuters reports that Iran's semi-official INSA news agency said members of an Israeli intelligence service network were discovered and arrested by the IRGC immediately following the shooting. Israel raised security levels at diplomatic facilities in other countries in anticipation of Iranian retaliation. And this is, of course, building off the propaganda campaign of recent weeks with Israel accusing Kodeh of being involved in these alleged plots to kidnap and kill Israeli officials and civilians as part of a global IRGC campaign. The last known Israeli assassination carried out inside Iran was, of course, the November 2020 killing of the scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. Now, on the same day, Benny Gantz, the Israeli defense minister, said that the U.S. was holding firm against removing the IRGC from the foreign terrorist organization blacklist. So this was fresh off his visit to the U.S., where he met with Lloyd Austin and Jake Sullivan, and he said the U.S. will, they're definitely not going to do it. They're not going to take the IRGC or the Quds Force off of this list, and he said that their position is quite decisive. He also refused to comment on the Kodeh assassination. Now, I'm going to move on to this piece by Trita Parsi, which I thought was very interesting at Responsible Statecraft. And he's asking, before Israel took responsibility, or it was reported in the New York Times that they had told the U.S. that they were responsible. It's not really an official, admission, but it's probably as close as we're going to get. But the thing is, there's a great piece by Trita Parsi about this, and he talks about why this happened right now. And one of the things I thought was notable is he points out that just to show how much worse in so many ways that Biden's administration is than the former administration he was a part of, the Obama administration. So Trita points out Obama's administration condemned Israel's earlier assassinations because they knew the murders wouldn't set back Iran's nuclear program, and that the only intent and impact would be to thwart and set back diplomacy. The killing of one scientist in 2012, just when the Obama team began moving quietly toward negotiations that would culminate with the JCPOA, provoked exceptionally strong denunciations by top American officials. Now, one of the things that Trita points out, which is very interesting, is that there had been reports that Iran was potentially open to compromising on the IRGC delisting issue, and Qatar had been acting as a mediator between the U.S. And Iran recently, and their foreign minister said as much the day before the assassination. Trita asks, is it possible that there was maybe even a breakthrough at hand that was squashed by all this? And Trita asks as well, if Israel was responsible, was it intended to provoke the IRGC and the regime's hardliners enough to make such a compromise impossible? He says it would clearly fit past Israeli patterns where their killings appeared timed to sabotage diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran, which, of course, we've seen with the sabotage attacks as well. Now, Biden, he also points out that the Iranians have continually argued that the FTO listing would make killing IRGC members legal under U.S. law. So the following day, Biden announces that it comes out, it's reported in Politico that Biden has made his final decision that he is not removing the IRGC from the Foreign Terrorist Organization blacklist. Which is, of course, severely lessening the chances at this point of the U.S. return to the deal. I mean, this is the worst news. The worst situation in terms of the talks that I've seen since Raisi came into office and they restarted the talks at the beginning of December. Of course, this is all just worsening the tensions. The first source for the report was a unnamed Western official, and then a second source said Biden had conveyed his decision to Naftali Bennett in an April 24th phone call. Bennett tweeted on the day, on May 24th, I welcome the decision by the U.S. administration to keep Iran's IRGC on the Foreign Terrorist Organizations list, which is where it belongs. He thanked Biden personally and called him a true friend of the state of Israel. Israel it was reported in the New York Times that they had told the U.S. that they were responsible for the assassination. So this is the day after Biden's final decision is reported. We have an unnamed intelligence official cited in a New York Times report saying that Tel Aviv has told Washington that they were behind the killing. Israel, of course, is still they at this point and to this day they're not taking official responsibility. Although Bennett pretty much implies in so many ways in recent quotes that they were in fact responsible, but they usually don't take official responsibility for the attacks inside Iran. It's usually revealed in leaks to the media. Now, Israeli officials claim in the report that Kodeh was not only part of the supposed global plot to kidnap and kill Israelis around the globe, but he was part of a covert IRGC group called Unit 840, which Iran says does not even exist. And despite Israeli claims, there is no evidence backing up these accusations of Iran targeting their people abroad. The report also cites Iranian analysts who believe that these provocations are designed to cause both sides to completely exit the negotiations or push Iran to react in a way that would be damaging, although they say that Iran, I think I'm paraphrasing, but the way they put it is, as usual, Iran will take the measured and calculated approach. Now, then we hear from Robert Malley that prospects for a return to the Iran deal are tenuous at best. And he said this to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Now, he said odds of a successful negotiation are lower than the odds of failure to the extent, and he acknowledges the debate that's going on right now in Congress. Although, I mean, such as it is, there's really not much. I mean, the Democrats have proven to be pretty pathetic and contemptible on this issue, just totally useless. Rand Paul seems to be more than anybody, actually, surprisingly, given his past record on the JCPOA. He's doing much more to try and push for a diplomatic solution here, and even saying that, you know what, maybe you should just go ahead and take the IRGC off the FTO list. Now, Malley says to the extent that there is a disagreement, I think he presents a false choice here because he goes to the extent that there is a disagreement in this room, it boils down to this. Are we better off reviving the nuclear deal and in parallel using all other tools at our disposal, diplomatic, economic, and otherwise, to address Iran's destabilizing behavior? Or are we better off getting rid of the deal and banking on a policy of pressure alone to get Iran to accept more onerous nuclear constraints and curb its aggressive policies? Now, I mean, when I read that again, I mean, perhaps he is, since I'm just reading it and I didn't actually see the way he presented it, it's possible that he wasn't, that he was pretty insistent that the second option wouldn't work. But if you could read it where he's almost suggesting that that's somehow possible. Although he of course he blames Iran's excessive demands for the failure in talks, and he says that if they want, he's arguing that this isn't related to the JCPOA, even though it's obviously a huge part of Trump's maximum pressure campaign, which based on the negotiations that have taken place in Vienna, as we've been covering, the maximum pressure campaign is supposed to be ended, and we're supposed to go back to essentially the status quo in 2015, with a few things changed. But the maximum pressure campaign is supposed to be, for all intents and purposes, it's supposed to roll the clock back to the original deal. The Iranians secured some concessions, at least at the time it appeared somewhere starting in December. Some of the agreements on advanced centrifuges and things like this, they wouldn't have to. They would only have to disconnect them. They wouldn't have to dismantle them. And it's kind of an insurance policy, but for the most part, that's what the agreement was. So I think Malley is being totally dishonest there. That's just certainly not fair and very underhanded. Now, hawkish senior Democrats and Republicans demanded to know what Biden's plan B is, which is ironic because that's, throughout virtually all of last year, especially the last half. That's what Israel kept saying. We have a plan B. Basically, it means a military attack of some sort. They criticized a possible revival of the JCPOA. Malley said all options are on the table, but he also said that an attack on Iran's nuclear program would only slow it down. It wouldn't stop it. Bob Menendez, of course, the ultra hawk chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, pushed back on Malley when he blamed Trump for the current situation. And I didn't write down the quote, but he says something essentially where it's like, looking back at the past is no way to go forward in the future. And then he demands to know what plan B is. And Malley said the U.S. is working with Israel and the Europeans to respond to and deter Iran's actions. Rand Paul said to Malley that it would be time we should put this issue on the table. And he says, I think we have to be open to it. I think it's important that if we do want negotiations, and the only way we're going to get any behavioral change is through negotiations, actually lessening sanctions is the only way you get it. So even things such as labeling them as a foreign terrorist organization have to be negotiated. I think people should realize that even if we get rid of the foreign terrorist organization label, the IRG has been under sanctions at least since 2007 for funding Hezbollah in Lebanon. So there still would be sanctions, but we have to at least think this through. The only way you get anywhere is you have to give something they want and they give something we want. I mean, it's not quite as strong as his father, but considering his competition in Congress right now, that's about as good as it seems to be. That's about as good as it gets. Now, then the U.S. added new sanctions on Iran, again, targeting the IRGC, but this is almost like a catch-all sanctions package. I mean, they're sanctioning this alleged Iranian-linked oil smuggling network, but it's supposedly a Russian-backed oil smuggling network that the U.S. says is providing funding for the Quds Force, which is, of course, the foreign arm of the IRGC. And the Treasury Department says that these sanctions target current and former Quds Force members and companies based in the UAE, Russia, and China over their alleged support for the Quds Force. Blinken's statement said, while the U.S. continues to seek a mutual return to full implementation of the JCPOA, we will strictly enforce sanctions on Iran's illicit oil trade. Now, Israeli officials are apparently furious over this leak I mentioned earlier. This is a report. I believe I read this in Times of Israel, and so a powerful Knesset committee actually warned that these leaks damage U.S.-Israel cooperation. They say it's not specified in the Times report which country the intelligence official source is from, but Ynet News says that the Israeli security establishment believes it was an American source. Israeli officials are now demanding answers because the leak, such as it is, absolves the U.S. of any involvement. That's what it says in the report, which I think is pretty interesting. Ram Ben Barak, a former deputy chief of the Mossad, who's the current head of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, said that this greatly harms trust in the U.S.-Israel relationship, damaging future cooperation. He demands the U.S. investigate the leak and figure out where it came from and why it happened. Barak denies Israel told the U.S. it carried out the killing without denying that Israel is actually responsible. He says, as far as I know, we did not inform anyone. We did not inform anyone or take responsibility, and that is for the best. Now, two people affiliated with the IRGC told the Times that Kodeh was a logistics officer who played a key role in transporting drone and missile technology to Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon and advised militias in Syria. Iran has said that Kodeh was involved in the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. This would obviously make a lot more sense than this phony idea that they're, running around the globe trying to kidnap and kill Israeli officials. One of the main things we've been noticing in the last several months here is that Israel is particularly targeting drone facilities of Iran, and that they're hyping up the threat of Iran's drone program. And there was actually an attack. An Iranian engineer was killed in a quadcopter suicide drone attack at the Parchin military complex near Tehran. So the New York Times reported on Friday, this is last week, that an Iranian engineer was killed in an attack last Wednesday on the complex, which is roughly 40 miles southeast of Tehran. The report cites 3 Iranians with knowledge of the incident and a U.S. official. The Iranian sources say that the complex was attacked with these, as I said, these quadcopter suicide drones. The Iranian Defense Ministry initially said it was an accident, but then later said that they viewed it as an attack. The drones exploded into a building used by the Defense Ministry for drone development. One person was also injured in the attack. Israel is suspected as having carried out similar attacks recently, such as the February attack on the drone producing facility in Kermanshah, which we covered back in March, as well as the attack on the centrifuge site at Karaj last June. If Tel Aviv is responsible, this would be the second attack in just 1 week. Now, after the assassination of the colonel, Bennett came out and said Iran has no immunity. I take this as more or less the admission. He says, as if to justify the assassination they still haven't admitted to, Bennett said Iran has no immunity, that they will pay the full price. And he goes on and on about how how Iran is targeting Israel through all these proxies, and he even says emissaries and terrorist organizations, and those who send terrorists, those who fund terrorists, those who back terrorists and support terrorists will pay the full price. His office is still not commenting at all on the assassination, but in broadcast remarks to ministers, Bennett said that Israel is now targeting the head of the octopus. And let's see. Now, then, what I also find interesting is after this report of all this sort of controversy between the U.S. and Israel over the leak. This is kind of a weird thing that happened. So there was a working group meeting this week of they call it they usually refer to it as the working group, but I guess the official name is the U.S. Israel Strategic Consultative Group, and it's of course headed by Jake Sullivan and his Israeli counterpart Eyal Hulada, and they put out a statement on the White House website that says it's all about Iran. It says the officials committed to coordinate on efforts to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon and toward deterring Iran's aggressive regional activities. They also discussed economic and diplomatic steps to achieve these goals and reviewed ongoing cooperation between the U.S. and Israeli militaries. U.S. and Israeli officials have committed that they will remain in close coordination on the full range of issues of mutual interest and remain united against all threats. It's just a little odd after all these successive attacks on Iran that in all likelihood are Israel, carrying it out, that the Americans after this dispute are coming out and basically saying that we're coordinating on the full range of everything going on here with is our policy on Iran. And so I don't know if that was that could have just been political or for PR, or that could have been a way of the U.S. saying, actually, yeah, we were involved in that too. And either way, it's very provocative. The Israeli Air Force on Tuesday night carried out those large-scale exercises we talked about 2 weeks ago that we thought the U.S. Air Force was going to be involved in with refueling craft. But that appears not to be the case. In fact, CENTCOM has come out and publicly denied that they were involved in these exercises. And these are sort of the bookend of the month-long Chariots of Fire exercises. So these took place over the Mediterranean Sea. Israel's Channel 13, and there, of course, the whole thing is they're practicing, a major air war on Iran, bombing their nuclear facilities and carrying out repeated airstrikes. And so Israel's Channel 13 reported that more than 100 aircraft were involved, as well as Navy submarines. And the drill spanned 10,000 kilometers. Jets were refueled twice. They circled Cyprus and performed mock airstrikes in Israel. The drills were part of, like I said, the Chariots of Fire exercise, where the IDF, including all branches, also trained for war with Hezbollah at the northern border. There were, in the reports I read 2 weeks ago on all this, they were talking about how basically they're preparing for war with Iran, but virtually all the contingencies they can think of, including having to face the axis of resistance concurrently, etc. Now, the drill is described as including long-range flights, aerial refueling, and striking distant targets, as to be expected. And of course, like I said, the Americans are apparently not participating. Of course, though, the new head of CENTCOM was, observing these exercises. I'm not sure if he was there for this particular final exercise over the Mediterranean, but he was there observing and visiting and watching the exercises, which is pretty provocative in and of itself. Now, I have some other news here. So Israeli intelligence sources say there's sort of this trend going on where we're hearing from certain Israeli factions, current and former intelligence and military officials, that they believe now that leaving the deal, and we heard this last year as well, we covered some of this, but that leaving the deal was a real mistake, and that, it's pretty, they're going to use, it's sort of like when the Democrats, if they ever make a point about why it's important to return to the deal, it's always done by hyping up the threat of Iran. So the idea is always that, well, we need the deal because they're going to get a bomb and this and that and the other thing. And so it's always like that. It can never be that, we just want to take war off the table and lift sanctions and, open up trade and these sorts of things, which are more the libertarian position, or that would be the way to justify it on libertarian grounds. But of course, we have intelligence sources telling the Jerusalem Post that there are factions now in Israel's defense and intelligence apparatus who believe that no deal poses a significantly greater risk than even a bad deal. And usually Israel sort of frames it where it's like any deal is a bad deal. But the argument is that even a bad deal would impose limitations on Iran's nuclear program, particularly on the weaponization of uranium. And I haven't been shown to ever have done that. But it's in terms of the way they're making the case. That's they're claiming that it's obviously going to be this huge threat if they, which makes sense because they have ramped up the program, but that's for leverage. But we're seeing a lot more hyperbolic reporting about Iran's nuclear program. And I'll get to that here more towards the end. There was a recent report in NBC News that I think is getting a lot of attention about that. But anyway, the concern is that if Washington walks away, Iran could feel pressured to weaponize their program, even if only to deter an attack after many years of constant threats from U.S. hawks and certainly Israel. And there's another report here in Responsible Statecraft. There's a senior Israeli military official who says the leaving the JCPOA was a mistake. According to Axios, retired Brigadier General Dror Shalom, current head of the Political Military Bureau in the Israeli Defense Ministry and former leader of the Military Intelligence Research and Analysis Division, stressed in a private meeting with U.S. State and Defense Department officials that leaving the JCPOA was a mistake and brought Iran closer to a nuclear weapon and created a much worse situation. The following week, we had the former military intelligence chief, Tamir Haiman, tell, I believe it's Israel Hayom, which is a right-wing newspaper, that Biden return to the deal would be in Israel's best interests. He said the JCPOA would offset the amount of enriched uranium Iran has. It would set it back, and it would buy us a very long time because enrichment takes a long time. Now, then the U.S., on top of these new sanctions that were added on this supposed, Russian-backed oil smuggling network, they seized a tanker in Greek territorial waters full of Iranian oil. So they're actually taking the oil back to the U.S. like they have in previous cases. And supposedly the ship was carrying 700,000 barrels of crude. Now, it was a Russian-operated ship with an Iranian flag and targeted by the U.S. since February when they announced sanctions on the Russian military bank. And it was impounded by Greece last month with its crew over the war in Ukraine, but then it was released. They actually changed their name from the Pegasus to the Lana in that time. And Athens says that the U.S. informed them that it was carrying Iranian oil and that the U.S. hired a different ship to transport the oil to America. Iran summoned the Greek Charge d'Affaires, calling the incident a clear example of piracy. Prior to this, now take this with a grain of salt because in Reuters they reported it, but it's from a group called United Against Nuclear Iran, which is chaired by Joe Lieberman. So I don't know. I mean, maybe these figures are off, and it would make sense. Let's just say in the narrative of trying to crack down on sanctions, or excuse me, on oil trade from Iran to China. But they claim that last year the Pegasus transported 3 million barrels of Iranian oil, with over 2.6 million barrels going to China. But again, just consider the source and take those figures with a grain of salt. Then, now after that, and this is of course blowback, but Iran retaliated by seizing 2 Greek tankers. So after the U.S. took the Iranian oil tanker, they seized these 2 tankers that were carrying Iraqi oil. And Blinken, of course, being the hypocrite that he is, called these unjustified seizures, and Greece demanded that the ships be returned and released. But of course, this is obvious retaliation. Iran was furious that Athens just stood by while their oil was stolen by the Americans, although Greece probably felt like there wasn't much that they could do. And similarly, I'm not sure there's much that can be done about the 2 Greek ships that were taken. Now, there's quite a bit of issues right now going on with the IAEA, just because, we've talked about extensively on here this whole story about the undeclared sites, and that has long been a stone in the Iranian shoe, and certainly a way for the U.S. and the Israelis, and now the Europeans, to really sort of thwart talks. And it's getting to be very difficult because the IAEA and Rafael Grossi, the director general, are acting in a very sort of political. It's very politicized. They, the Iranians, we've talked before, they secured this deal, I believe, in March early March, where they came up with an agreement that Iran would provide these documents, sort of, explaining what happened at these 3 sites. There was previously, conjecture that the sites had been contaminated by, IAEA inspectors themselves. It's possible that, or there's been speculation, certainly, that Israel was the nation that said that you can find these, whatever, you'll find these undeclared sites that you haven't checked yet, and that encouraged the IAEA to go look there. But there's 3 sites, and this issue should have been resolved. I mean, I thought that it was, once they came to this agreement, and actually Iran handed in their documents way ahead of schedule. I don't even think this was even supposed to be really sorted out until this month. But however, it's becoming a major issue politically for the Iran talks. And so we have a Wall Street Journal report on top of all of that, because that's sort of the backdrop, that no matter what Iran does to try and verify what's going on there, the IAEA won't take they just won't accept the evidence that Iran is presenting. And they just keep going, well, you're not clarifying. You're not clarifying. We still have unanswered questions. We still have unanswered questions. And in the backdrop of all that, Israel, this is on the 25th, there was a Wall Street Journal report citing sources provided by Israel, again, from the trove that they supposedly stole from Iran in 2018. Remember the big presentation that Netanyahu gave before Trump left the JCPOA. Now, of course, Israel has a horrible history of using all kinds of forgeries and documents that are clear forgeries that they've worked on with the MEK, and Gareth Porter is the best expert on all that. But so they claim that Iran had access. Now they're saying that they haven't released this, but until now, and they claim that Iran had access to IAEA documents on their own nuclear program between 2004 and 2006. The report is based on the assumption that Iran has a nuclear weapons had a nuclear weapons program that they covered up, that they were trying to hide, and they used this information to facilitate the cover-up. Having the documents would allow Tehran to know what the IAEA knew and what they were looking for, and would give them kind of a head start on sort of getting ahead of any kind of inspections. And the report says they also would have advance notice of surprise inspections. Now, I think this should be viewed with severe skepticism, because it's likely that this is just an Israeli propaganda op, because this is extremely delicate time right now politically, and especially because Israel just carried out this killing. Israel has had a lot of bad PR lately, and of course they're trying to kill the deal at the same time. And right now is a perfect opportunity for them to really drive a wedge between Iran and the IAEA, and that seems to be working, actually. So now the latest IAEA report that came out this Monday, Iran is firing back about, and they're saying that it's completely unfair, and they're saying it's not fair and balanced. They said, let's see, the report that they put out about accusing Tehran of not clarifying the issue of these trace particles of unprocessed uranium. He says, unfortunately, this is Saeed Khatizbeda, the foreign ministry spokesman. He says, unfortunately, this report does not reflect the reality of negotiations between Iran and the IAEA. He said, it's not a fair and balanced report. We expect this to be corrected. The IAEA says that they still have questions, which were not clarified, regarding the undeclared material found at these 3 sites, which are Marivan, Veramin, and Turkazabad. And the IAEA also announced Monday that Iran's uranium stockpile has grown to 18 times the limit established in the original 2015 nuclear deal, which is, of course, a result of the sanctions and Trump leaving the deal, which obviously their stockpile is growing, even though they're trying to convert some of these uranium excess stockpiles into fuel themselves. They're supposed to be able to ship it abroad to places like Russia to have it reprocessed into fuel. But of course, that's being prevented. And so the stockpile is growing at more or less a steady rate. But the IAEA is putting out these documents, which are seized upon by hawks and anybody who's trying to kill the deal right now. And so everybody's panicking over this, when it makes total sense why that's occurring. And Iran also is saying that Israel's hand in the latest IAEA report is pretty obvious. To quote, they're saying it is feared that the pressure exerted by the Zionist regime and some other actors has caused the normal path of agency reports to change from technical to political. And that was Saeed Khatizbeh, the foreign ministry spokesman. Now, on top of that, Naftali Bennett is now coming out and sort of dancing on these supposed stolen documents, and he's now putting out statements basically encouraging them to just kill the deal. He goes, after Iran stole classified documents from the UN's atomic agency, Iran used that information to figure out what the atomic agency was hoping to find and then created cover stories and hid evidence to evade their nuclear probes. So how do we know this? Because we got our hands on Iran's deception plan a few years back. Iran lied to the world. Iran is lying to the world again right now, and the world must make sure that Iran doesn't get away scot-free. And as they note here in Al Jazeera, which is an interesting point, the documents are from the years 2004 and 2006. They certainly don't cover the period during or after the nuclear deal was signed in 2015. Now, the other thing I will point out is that there's a report in NBC News right now where they say Iran has enough uranium to build an atomic bomb, and it's the IAEA that's apparently saying this. And so and basically the main point they're making is that they're being unclear about these reports at the undeclared sites. But one thing that they do, and the Americans and the E3 are set. They're working on this draft resolution where they're going to encourage the IAEA to rebuke Iran here on the 6th for the quarterly meeting of the IAEA and their 35-nation board of governors. And Iran is demanding that the probe be resolved. They think that this is just totally politicized and that they're just going to be hassled over this no matter what they do, which is not good, of course. But now, and that could obviously make things a lot worse as far as prospects for the deal and what could happen if it falls apart entirely. But now the IAEA is saying that, according to NBC News, is saying that Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium hexafluoride has reached 43.3 kilograms, roughly 95 pounds, an increase of nearly 10 kilograms from 3 months ago. Because in April, I thought they only had, I'm not sure, because I remember in late April that I was reading that they had 7 kilograms stockpiled of it. But now they're saying, experts say that the stockpile would provide roughly enough material for an atomic bomb if Iran took the additional step of enriching uranium to 90% purity. And they go, moving from 60 to 90% would not pose a technical challenge for Iran, according to arms control experts. That's not, certainly since they haven't done that before, I don't think it would be necessarily just this easy step the way they present it. And of course, the timeline is way off. So the way they're trying to scare people, they're now saying that they can make a bomb in days. They've dropped the whole thing about it's in weeks. So now, of course, they're just leaving out it could take months and even years to create a delivery vehicle and all the processes they have to go to make a weapon, and then they have to test it, and they would lose all of the uranium they have stockpiled just to make that one bomb. And of course, the intelligence inside Iran, the Americans and I don't know, but anyway, the Americans would certainly know what's going on, and there would be a war before they ever got one, I presume. But regardless, this is just completely, the timeline is way oversimplified in order to really scare the public about the possibility of Iran weaponizing its nuclear program, which, again, they've never been shown to have done. And I just got to say, at this point, it looks like, Congress did the best they could in the last we covered this in the last couple of months, where they seemed to launch a massive anti-Iran campaign trying to squash the deal. There was, of course, that non-binding resolution passed in the Senate where they said that they would never accept Biden removing the IRGC from the FTO list. But there was also all these Democrats who came out of the woodwork and former intelligence officials and people like, of course, Elliot Abrams, but he was, and then Tom Cotton led his own group of Republicans to come out and oppose the whole thing. So there was this major message sent to Iran and to Biden that there was more or less a bipartisan consensus, because it's virtually all the Republicans and many Democrats who are completely opposed to this deal. And of course, the Democrats just absolutely just don't care about the issue. And it seems like they have no, even if only to just reverse, Trump, the worst guy who ever lives, policy on Iran, or certainly they're not even trying, forget pushing them on Biden's campaign promises to return to diplomacy. But yeah, we're just not seeing any movement there. And certainly Israel has been subverting the return from the very beginning, announcing that they're racing for a nuclear bomb right now as soon as the talks restart at the beginning of December. But now it looks like Israel has this multifaceted, massive campaign to kill the deal entirely. And it does seem like Biden and his men are, providing them a layup to do it, or maybe it's the other way around. But either way, I mean, especially with the IAEA intransigence and just how political this is getting, and just, I mean, it's so disappointing every time you see that the IAEA is hyping up these threats and really stoking all this propaganda about the how the idea, just all the, of course, like they it took Iran like almost half a year to get them to condemn the attack on the Karaj facility, where Israel destroyed those IAEA cameras in the centrifuge facility. And the IAEA like has to just shrug in embarrassment when Iran brings up Israel's well-known nuclear weapon arsenal. And so the whole thing is just so pathetic and embarrassing. But I do think, I honestly, at this point, I just think that we're just, it's a matter of time before it's, the deal is declared dead. And after that, I don't know what happens. Trita Parsi has a great piece I recommend people look at, his column in MSNBC recently, which you ran at antiwar.com, but I think it's called Has Biden Lost the Plot on Iran? He makes the case that Biden has brought us closer now to war with Iran than any president, including Bush and Trump. I mean, it hasn't been this bad. In fact, the one thing I can possibly say that might make things a little bit less might ease our concerns a bit is that his main point there, or one of them anyway, was that he was extremely concerned that CENTCOM was going to be deploying these Air Force refueling jets for this drill, that would be a major escalation. But even if they didn't, Trita's main point in that column is that if Israel goes ahead and does this attack, and they are stepping up. I mean, this is like the fourth or so attack that we know of on Iran. I mean, there were a couple of drone attacks that we covered back in March, including the one in Kermanshah. But and it caused, then the Israelis retaliated at that what they claim was a Mossad base in Erbil with their ballistic missiles. But it's just his treatise point is that if Israel goes ahead and does something, which they've threatened to do many times. I mean, Netanyahu used to threaten Obama with this kind of thing, that they might just go ahead and attack Iran, and then you'll have to deal with it. But treatise says that if they do that, it'll be viewed as a U.S. declaration of war on Iran. The same way, the Houthis are under no illusions about what's going on, or before the ceasefire, thankfully. But when when the war was, I mean, it just even a few months ago, the common understanding of Yemenis and Houthis is that it's the American war. They don't see it as like the Saudi war on Yemen. They see it as the American war on Yemen with their proxies. And that's the way Iran sees the current situation with Israel. So it's just, I'm very concerned that if this does happen, that, you can understand, like, out of a sense of self-survival and if Iran is not, who knows how much longer they'll hold on to these sort of declarations by the Ayatollahs that they won't go ahead and build nukes. I wouldn't be afraid that they would use them if they did, unless they felt absolutely threatened and they were attacked. Even then, I'm not 100% sure they would ever use them. But there's no evidence they ever sought the nuclear weapons, and in fact, they've declared it completely haram. So I just if they do push them out of the NPT, which is very possible, and it does seem to be the goal at this point, look at the way the IAEA is pushing them around. That could, that would de facto be the same thing as them getting a bomb, because that's what all the hawks are going to say. That's what the Israelis are going to say. That's what the Abraham's Accord states are going to say. So, and of course, the Europeans are just completely spineless vassals. So, this looks very, very bad, I have to say. Sorry, I don't have better news, but it's been a crazy last couple of weeks with all the Iran news going on. This is Biden's administration is just a joke. I mean, the idea that Robert Malley, who was supposed to be the adult in the room, is at this point blaming them for everything, Tehran, and then going, all options are on the table at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, leaving Rand Paul to be the voice of support for the JCPOA, which was supposed to be Obama and the Democrats' probably their biggest accomplishment of this century. It's just nuts. But anyway, that's the Iran report for the last 2 weeks.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for coming back on the show and giving that report. Sorry, try and get your picture back up here before we sign off. All right, Connor. Thank you so much. And just remind people to share the show at the Libertarian Institute on Twitter at @con_interest for the show. Connor, you are Freeman's Mind 96. And you can follow me on Twitter at Anzalone_. Thanks, Connor.
Thank you, Kyle. Thanks, everybody.